Carl Jung uncovered a psychological principle so powerful that when empaths finally understand it, they become completely immune to manipulation. This isn't about building thicker skin or learning to be less sensitive. Jung discovered that empaths possess a natural psychological mechanism that, when activated consciously, makes them absolutely untouchable by narcissists, energy vampires, and emotional predators. The mechanism was hidden in plain sight throughout his entire body of work, but he only explicitly named it in his private correspondence during the final years of his life. He called it psychological sovereignty through shadow mastery, and it works by reversing the exact dynamic that makes empaths vulnerable in the first place. Every manipulator depends on the empath's unconscious participation in a specific psychological contract. Jung realized that empaths unknowingly agree to carry other people's rejected shadow material, and this agreement happens so deep in the unconscious that most empaths don't even know they've made it. But when an empath learns to consciously recognize and refuse this contract, something extraordinary happens. They don't just protect themselves from manipulation, they become psychologically impenetrable. The manipulator's tactics simply stop working, not because the empath fights back, but because the entire foundation of manipulation collapses without the empath's unconscious cooperation. Today, I'm revealing Jung's complete framework for activating this natural protection mechanism that every empath already possesses, but doesn't know how to use. This changes everything you thought you knew about empathic vulnerability, because Jung discovered that empaths were never actually weak. They were unconsciously powerful in ways that made them appear weak, and learning to redirect that power consciously transforms them into something manipulators instinctively avoid. Jung's breakthrough came from observing a pattern that appeared consistently across decades of clinical work. He noticed that empaths who had been systematically abused for years could suddenly become completely immune to the same tactics that had controlled them for so long. The transformation didn't happen gradually through therapy or slowly building confidence. It happened in a single moment of psychological recognition that Jung called the sovereignty activation. He documented this pattern so carefully because it contradicted everything psychology believed about personality change. These empaths weren't developing new capabilities, they were activating something that had been dormant inside them all along. Jung wrote in his private notes that empaths carry what he termed the sovereign function, a psychological capacity for absolute self-determination that remains unconscious until a specific trigger activates it. The trigger wasn't external circumstance or therapeutic intervention. It was an internal recognition that Jung spent years learning to facilitate in his patients. When an empath finally sees the complete truth about the psychological dynamics they've been participating in unconsciously, their sovereign function activates automatically. Jung compared it to a fail-safe mechanism built into empathic psychology that engages when unconscious participation becomes too dangerous to continue. The mechanism works through what Jung identified as the shadow reversal principle. Empaths typically absorb other people's shadow material, the denied and rejected aspects of their personality that they cannot consciously accept. Narcissists, manipulators, and energy vampires all share one common trait. They have massive shadow material that they desperately need someone else to carry for them. They cannot tolerate feeling their own shame, inadequacy, cruelty, or selfishness, so they unconsciously project these qualities onto others. The empath, with their highly developed capacity for feeling and their unconscious desire to help heal others, automatically absorbs this projected shadow material. Jung realized this absorption happens through a specific psychological mechanism. The empath feels what the manipulator refuses to feel, thinks what the manipulator cannot think, and carries emotional weight that belongs entirely to someone else. This creates what Jung called the carrier dynamic, where the empath becomes an unconscious container for psychological content that isn't theirs. The manipulator experiences relief because their shadow material is being held by someone else, The empath experiences overwhelm because they're processing their own psychological content plus everything they've absorbed from others. But Jung discovered something that manipulators instinctively fear and work desperately to prevent. When an empath becomes conscious of this carrier dynamic, they gain the ability to refuse it, not through confrontation or boundary setting, though those can be useful tools. The refusal happens at a much deeper level. Jung called it psychological non-consent, the withdrawal of unconscious agreement to carry shadow material that doesn't belong to you. This withdrawal doesn't require the empath to announce anything, fight anyone, or even change their external behavior dramatically. The shift happens internally, in the unconscious realm where the carrier dynamic was operating. When an empath achieves psychological non-consent, manipulators can still try their usual tactics. They can still project, gaslight, guilt trip, and emotionally manipulate. But none of it lands anymore because the empath is no longer unconsciously available to receive and carry what's being projected. Jung observed that this creates immediate disorientation in manipulators. They sense that something fundamental has changed, even though they cannot consciously identify what. Their tactics that worked perfectly before suddenly feel ineffective. They escalate briefly, trying harder to re-establish the unconscious contract. But when the empath maintains psychological non-consent, the manipulator eventually gives up and moves on to find someone else who will unconsciously agree to be their shadow carrier. Jung identified the exact process through which empaths can activate their sovereign function and achieve psychological non-consent. He called it the 3 recognitions, 3 specific realizations that must occur in sequence for the sovereignty activation to be complete and permanent. The first recognition is what Jung termed shadow clarity. The empath must consciously recognize and accept their own shadow material completely. Not just intellectually acknowledge it, but viscerally accept that they contain every human quality, including selfishness, cruelty, manipulation, and indifference. Jung observed that empaths resist this recognition more intensely than almost any other personality type because their entire identity is often built around being good, kind, and caring. The thought that they could be selfish or cruel feels like psychological annihilation. But Jung discovered that this resistance is precisely what makes empaths vulnerable to carrying others' shadow material. When you cannot accept that you contain certain qualities, you cannot recognize when someone is projecting those exact qualities onto you. You unconsciously accept their projection as truth because you haven't integrated your own shadow enough to distinguish between what's yours and what's theirs. Shadow clarity requires the empath to do something that feels terrifying at first. They must consciously acknowledge their capacity for every behavior they've witnessed in their abusers and manipulators. Not that they will act on these capacities, but that they contain them as potentials within their complete human psychology. Jung found that empaths who achieved genuine shadow clarity reported an immediate sense of psychological freedom. They stopped feeling responsible for other people's emotions because they could finally distinguish between their own shadow material and what others were trying to make them carry. The second recognition Jung called projection perception, the ability to recognize in real time when someone is projecting their shadow material onto you. This skill develops naturally once shadow clarity is achieved because you can only recognize projection when you're no longer unconsciously participating in it. Jung taught his patients to notice specific psychological sensations that indicate projection is occurring. You feel emotions that seem disproportionate to the situation. You're being accused of motivations you don't actually have. Someone is describing you in ways that don't match your internal experience. You feel confused because what they're saying about you doesn't align with what you know about yourself. These sensations aren't signs that you're crazy or wrong. They're your psyche's natural alarm system, indicating that you're being asked to carry shadow material that isn't yours. Jung observed that once empaths develop projection perception, They stop automatically absorbing what's being projected. Instead of unconsciously accepting accusations, blame, or emotional dumping, they can recognize these as attempts to make them carry someone else's psychological content. This recognition alone creates significant protection because consciousness interrupts unconscious participation. The third recognition is what Jung called sovereignty claiming, the moment when the empath consciously chooses to refuse the carrier dynamic permanently. This isn't about setting boundaries with specific people, though that may follow naturally. Sovereignty claiming happens at the level of psychological identity. The empath decides at the deepest level of their being that they will no longer function as an unconscious container for other people's rejected shadow material. Jung noted that this decision must be absolute to be effective. Partial sovereignty doesn't work because manipulators are skilled at finding and exploiting any remaining unconscious willingness to carry their shadow content. The empath must claim complete sovereignty over their own psychological space, meaning they take full responsibility for their own shadow material while absolutely refusing to carry anyone else's. When all three recognitions occur in sequence, Jung observed what he called the sovereignty seal, a permanent psychological shift that makes the empath functionally immune to manipulation tactics that previously controlled them. The seal doesn't make the empath cold or closed off. It makes them psychologically clear about what belongs to them and what doesn't. Jung documented that empaths with activated sovereign function can still feel deeply, love fully, and offer genuine compassion. But they do so from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. They help others when they genuinely choose to, not when they feel guilty or manipulated into it. They feel compassion for others, pain, without believing they're responsible for fixing or absorbing it. They can be present for someone's struggle without taking that struggle into their own psychological system. Jung discovered that the sovereignty seal creates what he termed psychological impermeability, a state where manipulation attempts simply cannot penetrate the empath's psychological boundaries. This impermeability doesn't require constant vigilance or defensive energy. Once established, it operates automatically at the unconscious level, the same level where the carrier dynamic previously operated. Manipulators instinctively sense this impermeability, even though they cannot consciously explain what they're sensing. Jung observed that narcissists and energy vampires consistently avoid empaths who have activated their sovereign function. They might test briefly to see if the old dynamics still work, but when they encounter genuine psychological impermeability, they quickly move on to easier targets. This creates what Jung called natural selection in relationships. Once your sovereign function is activated, people who related to you through unconscious exploitation gradually fall away, while people capable of authentic, reciprocal connection naturally gravitate toward you. The process Jung outlined for activating sovereign function begins with what he called shadow inventory, a systematic and honest assessment of your complete psychological contents, including everything you've been taught to reject or deny. Jung developed specific practices for shadow inventory that his patients found transformative. Spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing yourself to think thoughts you normally suppress. Write uncensored about qualities you possess, but rarely acknowledge to others or yourself. Notice when you judge others harshly and ask what you're rejecting in yourself. Acknowledge moments when you've been selfish, manipulative, cruel, or indifferent without justifying or explaining them away. Feel the full range of human emotion, including rage, hatred, jealousy, and contempt, without immediately trying to transform or transcend these feelings. Jung emphasized that shadow inventory isn't about acting on shadow impulses. It's about consciously acknowledging that you contain the full spectrum of human psychological potential. This acknowledgement paradoxically makes you less likely to act unconsciously on shadow impulses, because consciousness creates choice, where unconsciousness creates compulsion. Once shadow inventory reveals your complete psychological contents, Jung taught his patients to practice what he called projection tracking, systematically identifying when and how they absorb other people's shadow material. Projection tracking requires honest observation of your emotional and psychological states, especially in relationship with others. Jung instructed his patients to notice patterns like feeling suddenly exhausted after interacting with certain people, experiencing emotions that don't seem to originate from your own life circumstances, thinking thoughts that sound like someone else's voice in your head, feeling responsible for problems you didn't create, or absorbing blame for situations beyond your control. Each of these patterns indicates unconscious shadow carrying. Jung taught that recognizing these patterns is the first step toward refusing them. Consciousness interrupts the unconscious agreements that make shadow carrying possible. The practice Jung found most effective for developing projection perception was what he called the separation ritual, a daily practice of consciously distinguishing between your psychological contents and absorbed material from others. The ritual involves sitting in silence and systematically reviewing your emotional and mental state. For each emotion or thought you're experiencing, ask whether it originated from your own life experience or whether it might have been absorbed from someone else. Jung taught his patients to physically gesture, as if removing and setting aside any content they recognize as absorbed projection. This might sound symbolic, but Jung observed that the unconscious mind responds powerfully to ritual action. The physical gesture of removal helps break the unconscious agreement to carry shadow material that doesn't belong to you. Patients who practiced the separation ritual daily reported rapid improvement in their ability to distinguish their own psychological contents from what they were unconsciously absorbing from others. Jung emphasized that sovereign function activation isn't about becoming immune to all influence or closing yourself off from deep connection. Empaths fear that protecting themselves means losing their sensitivity and capacity for genuine relationship. Jung discovered the opposite. Empaths with activated sovereign function actually develop deeper and more authentic connections because they're relating from consciousness rather than unconscious compulsion. They can feel others' emotions without absorbing them as their own. They can offer support without taking responsibility for outcomes they cannot control. They can love deeply while maintaining clear awareness of where they end and others begin. Jung called this state conscious empathy, the ability to attune to others' inner experience while maintaining sovereignty over your own psychological space. Conscious empathy is actually more useful to others than unconscious absorption, because you can help someone navigate their psychological contents without getting lost in those contents yourself. Jung observed that empaths who activate sovereign function often go through what he called the relationship clarification phase, where existing connections either transform or dissolve based on whether they were built on authentic reciprocity or unconscious exploitation. This phase can be painful because it reveals which relationships were genuine and which were based on your unconscious willingness to carry others' shadow material. Jung noted that some people will adjust to your activated sovereignty and the relationship will deepen into authentic connection. Others will resist your sovereignty because they depended on your unconscious participation in their shadow projection. These relationships typically cannot survive sovereignty activation because they were never built on mutual recognition of each other as complete sovereign individuals. Jung taught his patients to trust this natural sorting process. Relationships that fall away during sovereignty activation were never serving your genuine development. They were unconscious agreements that needed to end so you could participate in relationships based on consciousness rather than compulsion. The most profound benefit Jung observed in empaths with activated sovereign function was what he termed unshakable self-knowledge, a level of psychological clarity that makes external manipulation impossible because you know yourself so completely that no one can convince you otherwise. Jung wrote that this self-knowledge is the ultimate protection because all manipulation depends on creating doubt about your own perceptions, emotions, and reality. When you possess unshakable self-knowledge, gaslighting doesn't work because you trust your own experience absolutely. Guilt manipulation doesn't work because you can distinguish between legitimate guilt for actual wrongdoing and manufactured guilt designed to control you. Emotional blackmail doesn't work because you're clear about what you're actually responsible for and what belongs to others. Jung observed that empaths with this level of self-knowledge often report that manipulators stop targeting them entirely. It's not that they're fighting off manipulation, it's that manipulators instinctively sense they won't be successful and don't bother trying. Jung's secret law that makes empaths untouchable is this principle he articulated in his private correspondence: consciousness of the shadow grants sovereignty over the soul. When you become fully conscious of your own shadow material, you automatically stop unconsciously carrying others' shadow material. When you stop carrying others' shadow, you become psychologically sovereign. When you become sovereign, manipulation cannot touch you because you're no longer unconsciously participating in the dynamics that make manipulation possible. This isn't a technique you practice. It's a psychological transformation you undergo. Once complete, it's permanent because you cannot return to unconsciousness about dynamics you've seen clearly. Jung believed that empaths who activate sovereign function represent an evolutionary development in human consciousness. They demonstrate that sensitivity doesn't require vulnerability, that feeling deeply doesn't mean absorbing everything, and that compassion can coexist with absolute clarity about psychological boundaries. Your empathic nature was never your weakness. Your unconscious relationship to your empathic nature created vulnerability that manipulators exploited. Jung's framework shows you how to maintain everything valuable about your sensitivity while activating the sovereign function that protects you completely. The empaths who become untouchable aren't the ones who learn to feel less. They're the ones who learn to feel everything while carrying only what belongs to them. This is Jung's gift to every empath who has been told their sensitivity is a problem. Your sensitivity is your greatest strength, once you learn to direct it consciously, rather than allow it to operate unconsciously in ways that make you vulnerable. The sovereign empath feels everything, sees everything, understands everything, and carries only what is genuinely theirs to carry. Write in the comments, "I reclaim my sovereign function." This statement marks your conscious decision to activate the psychological mechanism Jung discovered. When you declare sovereignty over your own psychological space, you begin the process of withdrawing unconscious consent from every dynamic that made you vulnerable to manipulation. Your declaration connects you with every empath, walking the same path toward conscious sovereignty. Subscribe, because the journey into Jung's most powerful psychological discoveries continues. Each exploration reveals another aspect of consciousness that transforms vulnerability into invincibility. This video showed you the foundation. The next revelation takes you deeper into psychological territory that changes not just how you protect yourself, but how you participate in reality itself. Jung uncovered principles about consciousness that most people will never encounter because they're too radical, too powerful, too threatening to systems built on unconscious manipulation. You've proven you're ready for these discoveries by watching this far. The next dimension of understanding awaits, and it will show you psychological capabilities you didn't know existed. Thank you for watching, and I'll meet you there.